course, we would like to, through the cultural diplomacy, we would like to solve this problem. How we can solve this problem? How far we can go to insult the people? How far we can insult, which become under our freedom? Is that the freedom of speech going all along and insulting the people, or freedom of speech has a limitation? This is a very important. We have a very special guest, of course, our brothers, and a very special guest, of course, coming there to talk about it, to see how we can rectify that through the many peaceful negotiation. I was, of course, shall we start with you? What say? Or I have a story, of course. I shall say it later. Please, Sir James, you take forward.
Well, I have one big comment about this.
Yes.
I believe that freedom of speech stops where malice begins.
Yeah.
So if this caricature is being done with the motivation of creating upset, confrontation, I don't think this is justified within the spirit of freedom of speech. That's a broad statement I'd like to make.
Excellent. And Keith, what is your opinion?
Well, I find myself in the unenviable position of really merely wanting to replicate what Sir James has just said, because I think it's a very wise commentary. We in this country, of course, do not have freedom of speech enshrined in the Constitution as the Americans do, and so therefore it is not regarded as quite so sacrosanct a right as it is across the pond in the United States. And many of you will be aware that it was only recently that we actually abolished our blasphemy laws in this country. That is not true in many other countries where there are still blasphemy laws. It seems to me that those sort of laws can be used as a tyranny, that they can actually be used as an instrument of the state or the majority to try to curtail a freedom of speech or legitimate criticism. And therein lies the paradox, therein lies the conflict between whether people should be able to have completely untrammeled freedom of speech, including maybe with the intention of offending and deeply offending many people's sensitivities, or whether there should be some kind of either legal or moral cap on what one can actually do. Now, I take Sir James's point about the freedom of speech ends where malice begins. The trouble is, as a lawyer, I know it's very difficult to try to prove malice. And I'm not sure that we really want to have these things debated endlessly in the courts of law, either as to the extent of the legitimacy of the law or its reach, or indeed as to whether some people may be regarded as having published with malice and others with not. We still have our libel laws in this country, although as Oscar Wilde may turn in his grave, of course we no longer have criminal libel, so you don't go to prison for libeling somebody. It is a civil action where you can claim damages, but in order to succeed, if you are accused of slander, which is the oral form, as you will know, and libel, which is the written form, you do have to demonstrate that justification is there. That, in other words, what you're saying about people was true in substance and form. So that is a safeguard. But I think ultimately, the way we need to resolve this is along the lines that Sir James has suggested, and that is to really draw a line, probably not legally, but probably culturally and in terms of general consent, that if you do something, if you say something, if you publish something which is deliberately designed to inflict harm on people with sensitivities, whether it be about their religion, their race, or whatever other aspect which they hold dear, then you are going beyond the bounds of propriety. Because what you're then doing is you are creating a very big fissure in social cohesion, and every society has to rest on its ability with people to live with one another.
Thank you, Chief Space, former MP.
May I have a comment there? I believe one of the greatest concerns in terms of the situation on a global basis is when a nation like the United States start to adopt a policy of positive disinformation, where they set the machinery to be able to discourage or disparage, bring down the good name of certain people for certain political reasons. Now, this coming from the nation which characterizes itself as being the most advanced democracy is very, very shocking, and in my view, it goes against the spirit that everybody has got a right to a reputation, and that everything you want to do must be done overtly. So when I hear that there is such a thing as policy of disinformation, whereby the state utilizes instruments that are available to knock people's reputation, not because it's justified or true, but in order to gain political advantage. I think this is.
Thank you, Sage. As on behalf, of course, our honorable friend Shafique, Brother Shafique, please, a few minutes.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and good afternoon to everybody, and it is a pleasure being here. Thank you to the organizers, Robin Marsh, Dr. Ramzy, and the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy for organizing this conference and giving us the opportunity to talk about, amongst other things, of course, this particular issue of religious offense and freedom of speech. Now, when Mark Bonfred was setting out the program for the day and talked about the agenda for the afternoon or throughout the next 3 days in terms of promoting cultural understanding, global human rights, and world peace within the Commonwealth, a thought occurred to me, well, wow, that's the easy stuff, you know. And I looked at the program, and we were down here as the panel looking at religious offense and freedom of speech. I said, that's the difficult one. So it's not fair that we've been given the harder job of trying to comment on an issue which is now presenting us in a particularly acute way. Of course, it is an age-old problem. It's not new. And sociologists and philosophers have prophesied over the years, haven't they? As a young undergraduate student in the 70s, I remember studying Peter Berger's secularization thesis, which talked about the end of religion by the end of millennium, i.e. year 2000. American sociologist who has, in effect, to be fair to him now, since formally withdrawn his thesis, and he said, yeah, put hands up, I was wrong. Religion has an incredible staying power, and whilst some parts of the world have gone through a process of evolution and change in some ways, the Reformation and Enlightenment, other societies have continued to be much more traditional and orthodox in their views. And I would like to, if you allow me, to set out the context, and we will launch straight into, if you like, in a sense, ab initio launch into what is freedom of speech, where it ends and where malice begins and so on, which of course I agree with, as I agree with what Keith has said. It's sort of stuff that's very difficult to disagree with. But I like to give it a bit of a framework, if you like, within which to try and make sense of where do we go in the context of this particular debate and how we might move forward. And I think that's essential in order for us to be able to make some sort of progressive sense of what's at stake here. Otherwise, we'll be talking just simply in terms of episodes and little snippets. It's noted probably difficult to resolve to the satisfaction of everybody. Of course, there are those people who regard free speech as a fundamental commodity, which is essential to democratic life and for the development of other liberties. Others see free speech as a luxury rather than a necessity, or at least as merely one right amongst others. And free speech, from this perspective, therefore, needs to be restrained within a shared social and cultural space. Now, all of this makes very good sense. And the answer to, however, whether religious and cultural sensibilities should ever limit free speech and expression depends largely on how one thinks about free speech between these two competing viewpoints. And this is what I meant by saying that unless you give it some framework, it's difficult to know where we're coming from. And for those who take free speech as a fundamental right, no amount of religious defamation or cultural hurt can be a reason for curbing free speech or applying censorship, as in the case of Charlie Hebdo, the event which has been already mentioned. For them, there is no free speech without exercising the right to offend. So in other words, the right to offend, if you like, is built into their part of the definition of what it means to have such a freedom. And therefore, offending religious and cultural sensibilities is an essential part of that. On the other hand, for those who are inclined towards the opposing position, some degree of censorship of and limitation on free speech is needed for maintaining social order and peace, which is the point which has been made recently by Keith and Sir James. No, there is often a very fine line, isn't there, between between the secular ideas of fair comment and religious offense caused by questioning the veracity of divine revelation. Blasphemy laws, as has just been mentioned, were once almost universal and are still common in states with strong religious traditions. But such restrictions have been extinguished in most secular societies that follow the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So to argue for the right of someone to speak or as he or she wishes is not the same as defending the wisdom of that person using free speech or expression in particular fashion or in particular circumstance. It's still less the same as defending the content of his or her offerings. Now take, for example, the visibly crude sketches of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a few months ago by the Charlie Hebdo organization, which provoked so much controversy and tragic deaths of the artists and of violence around the world. One may well seek to defend the right of people to publish such material with intellectually sound arguments, but I would also question the wisdom of such deliberately incendiary publications and strongly challenge the sentiment expressed in it. And there's therefore a distinction to be made between the right to something and the wisdom of exercising that right in a particular fashion. Tariq Mahmood, a famous sociologist at Bristol University, has put it like this: if people are to occupy the same political space without conflict, they mutually have to limit the extent to which they subject each other's fundamental beliefs to criticism. However, one essential qualification I would add to that is, for giving some credence to Tariq Mahmood's observation, is that in my view, and this is my final comment, is that qualification is provided by the philosopher Shabir Akhtar, who says very helpfully, and it draws a distinction between making a sound historical criticism as opposed to scurrilously imaginative writing or drawing of sketches. And I think that's a very important difference which will enable us to try and make sense of where freedom of speech.
Thank you, Professor. Very kind of you. What we want to do, we want to get the really discussion going, and otherwise, if we want to talk in 10 minutes each, there is not enough time. Please, Rabbi Marsh.
I'm going to have to cut down what I said, but was planning to say, but I wanted to highlight the role of interfaith and interreligious dialogue, and particularly understanding each other's faith. And particularly Universal Peace Federation started with the founding purpose to create a chamber in the United Nations for interreligious dialogue. And the purpose was to try to understand each other's cultures, each other's religious backgrounds more effectively, and to reduce the problems that would arise. For example, when American forces went into Iraq, I'm sure that many of the American soldiers from the Midwest or the Bible Belt, they had no idea that burning the Quran would create such a chaos and riots from Jakarta to Lagos or in many other places. And that the consequences of, for example, of something happening around Al-Aqsa Mosque would cause such problems in different parts of the world. So having a venue for interreligious dialogue enshrined within the United Nations would enable us to have much better and effective interreligious dialogue and also interreligious understanding. This I would like to think would help to remove a lot of the barriers that we face between us in our different cultures, our different areas of the world, and particularly if religious people were sincere to their attendance to their faith, they should actually be concerned about other religions and other areas of the world more than their own. In this context, I would like to say that we would avoid issues such as the Charlie Hebdo case, etc., by having a greater understanding that that kind of incident actually creates the murder and the death of many Christians, for example, in different parts of the world. So there would be a much greater sensitivity then to the consequences of having of the offence that's caused in different parts of the world by having freedom of speech expressed in such a way.
Thank you. What I was going to say here is, of course, I would like to put a question to all the panels. I always fight for the freedom of speech, but I hate there has to have a limitation, not a freedom of insult. I hate the freedom of insult. Now, I spoke to universities and with the government and with the many's. This country, what we have, of course, is the law is different with France. France is going higher to freedom of speech, do anything as you like. But in this country, the freedom of speech is a freedom until it does not turn to hatred. Therefore, I would like to say to all panels, would you like me to insult you as a freedom of speech, insult your mother, father, and this sort of thing? Would you like me to insult as a part of freedom of speech, which we have, which Oxford University said we have to have in freedom of insult? Is that right? Is that going part of the humanity? Where are we going? Where we stop? Please start very short.
I find the statement elaborating the concept of democracy, where it is stated that in a democratic society, even a crank or an extremist has got the right to his views. But I'm very concerned with this. And taking awareness of the world as it is, of different civilization and different nation, I think we should utilize the concept of he who is in Rome must do as the Romans do. So we should respect the law of the land at all times. I'll give you an issue which is reverberating in Seychelles. Only a few weeks ago, the British High Commission performed the act of same-sex marriage at the British Embassy.
Yes.
In a country which is 90% Roman Catholic. So you had the Bishop, Church of England Bishop, outcrying, the category of outcry. Apparently, it is law in England, this can be performed. Now, according to diplomatic law, the British embassy constitutes British territory, right? Now, in my view, this High Commissioner would have told to Westminster, I don't want to go forward with this, because if I was the ambassador of Britain in Saudi Arabia, I would not be allowed, I would be accused of inciting. In other words, it was not to be seen as diplomacy.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll present to you.
Yes, I'll be brief.
Yes.
I think when you look at what binds society together, as the theme I was advancing a moment ago, there are three central tenets. I think one is understanding, which Robin referred to, forbearance and courtesy. You actually don't legislate for any of those. There is no rule that says I have to understand somebody else's religion or ethnicity. There is no rule that says I should not queue jump or push in front of somebody who wants to get on a bus, especially if it's the last place there. But if people do that, there is a general round condemnation by others in society who may not put it into terms such as I have, but nevertheless do understand that for a society to be cohesive, those three elements have to be present. And that is what I meant by not trying to legislate for this. I think where there will always be the tension between freedom of speech and that impinging on sensitivities, whether they're cultural, ethnic, religious, whatever they may be, or insulting your mother and father. I think you have to be quite clear that where there is that narrow distinction, that one has to have a presumption that freedom of speech is more important, because otherwise you are going down a route, a very slippery route to tyranny and curtailment of people's liberties. But that said, I just want to end by saying this. I think it's also important that everybody, and I include religions in this, understands that they do not have a sacrosanct right to compel others to their own sensitivities. I think sometimes the British are famous for their sense of humour. I think sometimes if people can look at themselves and laugh a little bit, and that includes religions, then some of these things which are seen as deeply offensive would seem to be less so. And frankly, the way you really deal with those who want to insult you is to ridicule them and allow them to destroy themselves. That is a degree of forbearance which eludes many, but nevertheless, I believe it's an axiom which many would do well to learn by.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent. And Professor?
Yeah, I'd like to agree with Keith Best, what he said, particularly, I think, and I'd like to, however, develop this point of the culture, if you like, of values and ethos and courtesies within which you almost behave in a way which is, without the legal constraint, you're able to observe sufficient protocol and courtesies which doesn't offend other people. And you almost sort of automatically know where the dividing line is without somebody telling you. I mean, if you think back to, say, 40, 50 years ago, most of the people who might be smokers would probably light up a cigarette in this hall here. Can you imagine that happening now? It will be unthinkable. And I think the law was only passed, about 10 years, not so long ago, that you couldn't smoke. There were sort of reserved places. But for many years before the actual legal obligation to refrain from smoking in buildings, people had a long time, in fact, given up the idea of ever daring to pick up a cigarette and light it up, etc. And I think it is. I think that's the crucial part of the culture, if you like, the values and so on, but how we build that. And there was one principle that was coming to my mind as Keith was speaking. I don't know what legal impact this will have, Keith, but it is, and I particularly have the Charlie Hebdo incident in mind. And as a Muslim, of course, as the chairman of the Council for Christian Muslim Relations, I had a big job in hand in my area in Wycombe, which is densely multiracial, multi-faith, and so on, and try and keep peace and order as well. We should statements appropriately worded to keep things in order, etc. And in which I made the point that yes, we're entitled to be insulted, feel insulted as a result of what has happened in Charlie Hebdo, but of course we're equally a million times more insulted by the action which has been done in the name of the Prophet, that we've avenged our Prophet. And immediately I was conjuring up visions of how growing up as a Muslim child and learning about the life and the works and the ethics and the morals of the Prophet as a role model and the sorts of life he led. And I said to myself, well, this is utterly inconsistent with what we know the Prophet himself to be doing in these circumstances. He certainly wouldn't be taking revenge in those ways. So in that context, the reaction was wrong. But the original action, however, if you apply it in the sense in which I've just described, the qualities, the human qualities, the moral qualities that the Prophet himself displayed during his life, it will be utterly unfair to depict him in the ways in which he was being depicted by those sketches. And I was saying to myself, well, supposing he was alive today, the test that I would apply, if there was a legal, if you like, route to this, or culturally bound rule to this, is if such a person was alive, would they be able to take a libel action against this person? Because it will be, if the answer to that is yes, I would say that that is the line that I would draw. And in addition to that, I think common sense should prevail in my judgment most of the time, as well in these circumstances. When somebody is the Prophet, the head of a faith or religion for billions of people around the world, what the heck were you trying to do to insult that person in the way that you're doing? What you're trying to get out of it? What is your motivation? And that's the other sort of related issue that I have with people like Charlie Hebdo and many others. Is there any sensible reason why you're doing what you're trying to do, to make what sort of point, apart from just causing trouble?
Very kind, thank you.
My personal feeling is when you're insulted, you have a choice of how to respond. You can respond in kind, or you can respond more wisely. Usually, to respond more from a faith perspective, to forgive, to understand, to seek to help the person to grow in their own personal understanding. That way is the better way. And that's the way to build more harmony amongst peoples, between nations, and so on. So my concern always is, how can we go beyond these and build greater harmony between different communities, different faiths, and different cultures? Usually, the best way is not to respond in the same way, but to try to take a higher view and let others particularly speak for you. So if you are in an interfaith context, then to have other faiths speak up for you is a much better way.
Thank you. The story which I had, of course, I said before I get the one question, and has to be very short and sharp. Of course, when the Charlie Hebdo happened, the awful things happened, and with those people, criminal people, which are killing the innocent people. But of course, there were about 1,000 French was in Oxford and Oxfordshire, front of the Oxford University. They stayed to say we are Charlie. And you know, all over the world come brand Charlie. And I take the Muhammad, I said, Jesus Muhammad. In the middle, in the front of Oxford, I'm part of the Oxford University, one of the special member, I stayed on the top and I said, freedom of speech, not freedom of insult. We are brother. Let's peace together. I stayed on top. Of course, we had many police. Police came to protect me of the, and other one. Everybody started to say the rude word. I said, look, this is my freedom of speech. I can say Charlie is extremist. I am freedom. I didn't insult him. I can. Now, when I am doing my right, you're telling me off. When you're doing something wrong, which I'm saying is wrong, you're telling me freedom of speech is mine? And of course, for that reason, police came and around, and people said, yes, you are right, stay there. Because it's the first. But in general, people understand what we need to do. We need to understand where we can end up the line, where is the freedom of speech. Of course, Sir James said, we give the question, and of course, I would like to have a very quick answer to it. Sir James says, we should respect the law of the land. Absolutely. Who said no? Respect the God, respect the law of the land. There is no question to it. But the law of the land can be changed. The law of God might not be changed, but the law of the land can be changed. I'm sure many times Keith changed the law. Here, they're going to the bill and they change the law. Now, do we need to change the law to suit all? To suit all, we have, of course, we have about 5 to 6 billion people going to follow the faith. Catholics, Christians, Muslims, Jews. Or should we take a mickey of all their leaders? Or should, the point is, the question is, do we need to change the law? Or just believe it as that, and time to time some killing happens, some argue happens, some that happen. What we do, please? And very short.
Look at the situation
and all have
against background of the greater picture of the world. And what I believe is fundamentally now questionable is whether that concept of one man, one vote democracy is really workable and in best interest of humanity at this time. I believe education is the most important element. I believe that ignorance is one of the things which brings about extremism, hatred, etc. If I give a man a gun and don't teach him how to operate this gun, he could utilize this gun and shoot himself. If I give man a vote, but he's not educated, he's easily manipulated, although he has certain common sense, his common sense is taken over within the cross currents of propaganda. I think one of the problems, even from the standpoint of the country of so-called extremism, they see too much freedom in the Western world. You are free to do this, free to do that, free to do that, free to do that. And they see the resulting result is strike, demonstration, etc., etc. And they are not prepared to go along the way because stability is quite important, and we do know ourselves. You take, and then double standard. You take the question of U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, but there's no human rights, no women's rights.
Thank
yes,
you,
we're not even, so how can, the people ask the question, and you see double standard, sacrificing principle for expedience. I think there must be a change of heart, which extend across humanity, the whole world, to accept that we need to change and we need to live like brothers, right? Or sort of some of the association exclusive to detriment of another one. There's too much borders. And so we're living in a time now when we have to do a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection, because there are far too many people in this world who are socialists as far as other people's wealth are concerned, but biggest capitalists when it comes to their own wealth. There's a lot of questions like this which could be addressed.
Excellent. We haven't got that much time. 1 minute each, and after that we
very briefly, as a former legislator, as you were kind to point out,
Of course.
and also as a lawyer, it may surprise you to learn I do not think legislation is appropriate. The trouble with laws is that in a fairly rapidly changing cultural environment, those laws become outdated and sometimes oppressive in a very short space of time. And if you're not to indulge in a frenzy of legislative renewment all the time in order to try to make them relevant, it's better to forbear and not to legislate in the first place. So James mentioned gay marriages. That's been a fundamental shift in attitudes in this country. There are still many people uncomfortable with it, but that won't be the case in the generation of my children growing up. They will take it as normal. You mentioned the whole question of smoking. Look at drink driving. Now, I know there is legislation there, but the attitudes of people in just one generation have changed massively. Attitudes towards women, towards cultural aspects, have changed considerably in this country, just in my lifetime. Now, you cannot possibly legislate knowing that something is going to be set in stone forever against that background. So that's why I think this is much more subject to cultural norms, to us actually discussing these things and gaining a degree of consensus which can move forward rather than trying to enshrine it in legislation.
Excellent. Brief, please.
Yeah,
There is no time.
I'm able to agree with most of what Keith has said. Actually, my difficulty in agreeing with that, on the one hand, as an academic and as somebody who's now fully aware of the customs and traditions in the West of intellectual freedom, and I agree that laws can bring their own drawbacks as well in societies and create martyrs and things like that, and that create equal, problems in equal measure. My difficulty is, however, at the moment, that it has almost become a kind of a game in the hands of certain people for whatever reason, a motivation that they may have, which is cross-cultural, which is political, which is blasphemous, which is based on hatred or dislike of other people, or because they just want to create trouble somewhere for various kinds of vested interests and reasons and so on. It's become a tool. This kind of approach has become a bit of a tool. They know that the Muslims and various other religious people are going to be provoked by this particular action. We want to cause a provocation. Here we go. Let's insult their prophet. And I have some difficulty with that in how to tackle that. If legal route is not open to us, which I agree the reservations that has been made, what is open to us? And I think maybe as a starting point, however, I think we should commit ourselves to the big national or international debate about this, to raise awareness about the challenges that this is throwing up and the problems that this situation is causing for us, and for people to become much more acutely sensitive and have the exposure to understand that the one people are trying to insult a figurehead, a revered figurehead. Why are they doing this? Should they be doing this? And would we actually look at them askance and actually show them the necessary, if you like, hatred of what they are doing, just as we would if you were lighting up a cigarette just now?
Thank you. Excellent member of the panels. But in conclusion, what I see, of course, from all our scholars coming is education. It is very important to educate the people. We may not necessarily need to change the law, but if we can concentrate on the education of our children, our friends, our brothers and our sisters, and through the interface, through the understanding, Muslim, non-Muslim, believer, non-believer, they all can live together and respect each other on the way which the human should do. Thank you very much, Robin, Shafique, and of course, Honorable Keith, and Mr. President, Sir James. Thank you, and a big round of applause. for the